Back in the day, medieval farmers were growing all kinds of strange and wonderful fruits, the kind you will never see in a modern supermarket aisle. Somewhere between hard necessity and creative survival, they ended up with a fruit basket full of weird little powerhouses that we have almost completely forgotten. So in this video, we are bringing back 15 lost medieval fruits that absolutely deserve a second chance. Some of them look suspicious, some of them taste incredible, and a few of them basically had to rot before anyone dared to eat them. But together they tell you a lot about how smart, stubborn, and creative medieval farmers really were. Let's start with maybe the most infamous of the bunch, the medlar. The poor medlar might be the most unfairly mocked fruit in history. It has one of the worst nicknames in all of food culture, open arse. I'm not making that up. Medieval people genuinely called it that because of the way the bottom of the fruit looks. Imagine an apple that shrank in the wash and then decided to imitate a cartoon peach. That is basically a medlar. Now, jokes aside, the medlar was a winter superstar. Picture a medieval farm in late autumn. The apples are gone, the pears are finished, berries have long disappeared, and the fields are crusted with frost. Almost nothing fresh is left to eat. Then there is this small brown fruit hanging on the tree, still clinging to its branches, even after the leaves have dropped. That is the medlar stubbornly waiting for its moment. But here is the twist. You cannot eat a medlar straight off the tree. Pick it and bite into it immediately, and you are going to think medieval people had lost their minds. It is rock hard, sour, and astringent, like chewing on wood flavoured with bad tea. For medlars to be edible, they have to go through a process called bletting, which is a fancy medieval word for let it rot a little on purpose. Here is how it worked. Farmers would harvest the medlars after the first frost when the cold had already started to break down the fruit a bit. Then they would spread them out in a cool, dry place, on straw in shallow trays or in a pantry, and leave them alone for weeks. Slowly the fruit would soften, the skin would wrinkle, and the inside would turn from pale and hard to dark, soft, and almost jam-like. If you did not know what you were looking at, you would assume it had gone bad and toss it in the trash. Medieval people looked at the same thing and thought, perfect, time to eat. And weirdly, they were right. Once properly bletted, the medlar completely transformed. The flavour turned deep and rich, like apple butter mixed with dates, a hint of cinnamon, and just a little bit of red wine. It was sweet, spicy, and complex, the kind of taste that felt like winter comfort food in one bite. No wonder medieval households were obsessed with them. Writers even got in on the trend. Medlars show up in Shakespeare and Chaucer usually as the butt of a dirty joke because of how they look and how they had to get soft and overripe before anyone could enjoy them. But underneath the jokes, you can tell people genuinely loved this fruit. It was both comic and luxurious, something that felt a little scandalous and a little special at the same time. If modern food enthusiasts suddenly rediscovered medlars today, you can easily imagine what would happen. Some trendy cafe in a big city would start selling heritage medlar jam on grilled sourdough with a sprig of thyme on top, charging $15 a slice. Food blogs would rave about its medieval notes of wine-soaked spice, and there would absolutely be a medlar season pop-up with fairy lights and handwritten chalkboard signs, and honestly it would probably taste amazing. But in medieval life, this was not a quirky luxury. It was practical survival with a bonus. Medlars ripened when everything else had already come and gone. When the fresh produce of autumn had vanished and winter was closing in, medlars were just beginning to be ready. They bridged the hunger gap between the last of the autumn harvest and the first greenery of spring. Families could store them without refrigeration, watch them slowly soften, and enjoy freshish fruit deep into the cold months long after other fruits had disappeared. You can almost picture a family at a rough wooden table, snow piled outside, breaking open the wrinkled skin of a medlar and scooping out that rich dark pulp with a knife, grateful for something sweet and strangely luxurious in the middle of a brutal season. Cooks turn medlars into all kinds of things. Thick sauces for roasted meats, spiced pastes and sweet preserves that functioned like a medieval version of Nutella minus the chocolate and plus a lot more fibre. You could mash them with honey, mix them into pies, or eat them straight with cheese and bread. A bowl of bletted medlars on the table signalled that yes, winter was here, but you were still doing well enough to have fruit. And that is really why the medlar deserves a comeback. It is not just a weird old fruit with an unfortunate nickname. It is a symbol of how medieval people refused to waste what nature gave them. They learnt that if you waited, if you stored carefully, if you understood the rhythm of the seasons, you could turn something inedible into something incredible. So the next time someone tells you medieval food was boring, remember the medlar, the fruit that had to rot a little before it revealed how good it really was. And that is only the first stop on this tour of forgotten medieval flavour. In the chapters ahead, we're going to meet 14 more fruits, just like this strange, stubborn, and surprisingly brilliant once you get to know them. But first, let this odd little winter survivor set the tone for the rest of our medieval fruit journey. If the medlar was the strange winter dessert of medieval life, then the sorb apple was the secret ingredient hiding inside the drink. Despite the name, the sorb apple was not a regular apple at all. Botanically, it sat closer to the mountain ash than to the orchard apples we know. Medieval people were not too concerned with the exact classification, though. They were not walking around with lab coats and microscopes. They just tasted things, watched what happened in the fermentation barrel and kept whatever worked. And the sorb apple worked. Imagine a small firm fruit that looks a bit like a tiny old-fashioned apple, with a slightly rougher skin and a more intense personality. Bite into it, and it is sharp tannic and a little wild, nothing like the polished sweetness of a modern supermarket apple. That bold flavour turned out to be perfect for brewing. Medieval cider makers quickly discovered that adding sorb apples to their regular apple mash transformed the drink completely. The tannins added grip and structure, giving the cider a deeper colour and a more complex taste. The natural sugars from the sorb apples brought in richer layered sweetness without needing any fancy tricks. Picture a wooden barrel in the corner of a cool cellar. Inside is a simple mixture of crushed apples, a handful of sorb apples thrown in by some farmer who decided to experiment and wild yeast doing its thing. A few weeks or months later, the result is a drink that tastes darker and fuller than usual, with a slightly bitter edge that makes each sip more satisfying. That is the kind of discovery that spreads very quickly by word of mouth. Over time, certain villages became known for this sorb-infused cider. In some regions of England and France, people could tell where a drink came from just by its taste. There were places whose identity, reputation and income were tied to these little trees and their unusual fruit. The value of sorb apples went beyond flavour. They played a quiet role in the local economy. There are old records showing that some farmers paid part of their taxes not with coins but with barrels of cider made with sorb apples. Imagine turning up at the manor or the estate and saying in effect, "I do not have enough silver, but I brought you this incredible drink." It sounds like a joke, but it was serious business. If the drink was genuinely good, it had real value. You can almost picture the scene. A clerk writes numbers in a ledger. A steward stands nearby, tasting from a cup drawn from the barrel, considering whether this is acceptable payment. The flavour from those small intense fruits is what decides if that family keeps their land or falls into debt for another year. Suddenly the sorb apple is not just a curiosity, it is the difference between security and risk. For a long time these trees were a normal part of the landscape. They grew in hedgerows on the edges of fields, in small orchards tucked behind cottages and barns. Then slowly they started to disappear. As agricultural practices changed and new apple varieties were bred and spread, people favoured trees that produced larger, sweeter fruit that could be eaten fresh or pressed into more predictable drinks. The quirky little sorb apple could not compete with the smooth marketing power of the shiny eating apple. By the 1700s and 1800s, the sorb apple was already falling out of favour. Orchards were redesigned around high-yielding uniform trees that made counting and harvesting easier. Hedgerows were cleared. Farmers stopped replanting older species when they did. Those village ciders that once owed their character to this strange fruit gradually lost that depth. The barrels still looked the same from the outside, but something subtle inside had faded. A few traditional orchards held on mostly in remote or stubborn areas where people were slower to change. In those places, someone might still have a memory of an older relative adding a handful of unfamiliar fruits into the cider press and saying, "Trust me, this makes it better." That memory is a faint echo of a time when the sorb apple was not rare at all. It was part of everyday life. Close to this story is another tree that mattered even more to medieval families, not just for flavour but for survival. This one did not just make drinks better, it was treated like a living savings account. The service tree looks modest. If you walked past it today, you might not even glance twice. The leaves are unremarkable, the shape is ordinary, and the fruit is small, brownish, and easily overlooked. But in medieval times, owning a mature service tree was like having a vault in the ground that paid out in calories instead of coins. A service tree could take decades to reach full productivity. 30 years was not unusual. For a society where many people did not live long enough to get grey hair, that was a serious investment in the future. Planting one of these trees was a commitment to the next generation, or even the generation after that. When the tree finally started to bear properly, the reward was incredible. The fruit looked like small brown pear-shaped or olive-shaped nuggets. Nothing glamorous at all. At first they were hard and almost impossible to eat. Just like medlars, they needed time. People would pick them and store them carefully in straw or other dry material, letting them soften slowly. Once ready, the fruit developed a rich, sweet taste that reminded people of dates and baked apples. Best of all, these little fruits could last for months. In a world with no refrigerators, no freezers, and very limited ways to store fresh produce that made them almost unbelievably valuable. While other fruits rotted and disappeared, the harvest from a good service tree kept showing up on the tail deep into winter. That long-lasting quality turned the service tree into property you could fight over, and people did. There are medieval legal records that show arguments in court over who owned a particular service tree or who had the right to harvest from it. Judges sometimes had to split the harvest between families, essentially saying, "You get every other year, or you get half the fruit." When disputes between neighbours reached that level, you know the tree was not just a plant, it was an asset like a piece of land or a herd of animals. Service trees even appear in wills and property documents. Someone might leave a house, a strip of field, 2 cows, and specifically the fruit from the large service tree on the western boundary. That fruit represented food security. If crops failed, if animals died, if trade routes closed, that tree still produced. The fruit fell every year, and as long as there were hands to gather and store it, the family had something sweet and dense to get them through lean times. Imagine an old tree, rough bark, marked by decades of seasons, standing at the edge of a small field. Children grow up under its branches. They are told that their grandparents planted it. It has been there through plagues, wars, bad harvests, good harvests, long winters, short summers. Every year the same pattern. The fruit appears hard and green, then ripens, gets gathered, and spends months tucked away in straw. slowly turning into a honeyed, dense food that helps people feel full when the rest of the pantry starts to echo. To us, it might look like nothing special. To them, it was stability rooted in the soil. These quiet, forgotten trees remind us that medieval people did not just survive on bread and bland gruel. They planned ahead with patience that is hard to imagine today, growing fruits that took decades to pay off and relying on flavours that were intense, tannic or strange, until time and care transformed them into something deeply satisfying. While families guarded their service trees like treasure chests rooted in the earth, another kind of tree became the quiet, beating heart of many religious communities. Walk into a medieval monastery garden, and you would find rows of herbs, vegetables, and in one corner a tree covered in small, glossy red fruits. That was the Cornelian cherry. Despite its name, the Cornelian cherry was not a true cherry at all. It belonged to the dogwood family, which sounds more like something you would carve a walking stick from than something you would eat. The tree did both. Its fruit and its wood were equally valuable, especially inside the walls of monasteries where monks juggled the roles of farmers, healers, record keepers, and sometimes emergency doctor. The fruits themselves were tiny and bright like little red droplets hanging from the branches. When they first appeared, they were hard and sour. If you bit into one too soon, you would get a face full of sharp, tart flavour that made apples taste mild by comparison. Let them ripen fully, though, and you got a deep wine-tinted taste that worked beautifully in syrups and preserves. Monks paid close attention to this fruit because it seemed to help the sick. Long before anyone used words like vitamin or immune system, people noticed that patients who drank Cornelian cherry syrup seemed to recover faster from fevers and colds. The fruit was rich in what we now call vitamin C, so in a world where winter diets could be painfully limited, it quietly kept scurvy and infections at bay. You can imagine a stone infirmary room inside a monastery lit by a small window and maybe a single candle. On a shelf sit clay jars sealed with wax, filled with dark red syrup made from boiled Cornelian cherries and honey. A coughing traveller or a pale novice lies on a straw mattress, while a monk carefully pours a spoonful of the syrup into a cup of warm water. It tasted sour and sweet at the same time, like tart cherries mixed with herbal tea, and for many people it felt like a potion of life in the middle of a bad illness. The fruit was not the only gift of this tree. Cornelian cherry wood is very dense and strong. Medieval craftspeople used it for tool handles, pegs, and even parts of weapons. Crossbow makers valued it because it could take pressure and strain without snapping. From a single tree, a community could get medicine for the sick, jam for the pantry, and wood for tools or arms. That kind of versatility mattered in a world where every resource had to earn its place. The reputation of the Cornelian cherry grew so much that rulers paid attention too. Some royal orders required these trees to be planted in estates and lands across an empire. It was an early form of public health planning. Plant enough of these and in theory more people could survive the winter without succumbing to disease. Not every fruit grew with such a saintly reputation. In fact, one of the most important tart fruits of medieval cooking eventually found itself accused of attacking the bread supply. Barberry bushes used to glow at the edges of fields and paths covered in bright red berries that looked like clusters of tiny lanterns. The branches were thin and thorny, which made them excellent for hedges. The berries were intensely sour, even more so than a lemon, yet they became a favourite tool in kitchens that had to work with a lot of heavy fatty meat. Picture a roasting spit turning slowly over a fire. On it is venison or boar, rich and oily. Without something sharp to cut through that richness, the meat could feel heavy and tiring to eat. Cooks learned to simmer barberries with herbs, onions and stock to create a sauce that sliced right through all that fat and brought the whole dish into balance. The role barberries played is similar to what cranberries do in some modern dishes. They woke up the plate. Healers appreciated them too. The berries hold a compound known today as berberine, which can fight certain infections. In an age full of questionable remedies involving powdered metals and strange mixtures, barberry actually did a bit of real work for the human body. Then came the suspicion. Farmers noticed a pattern. Areas full of barberry bushes seemed to also suffer from more cases of a terrible disease in wheat called rust. The plants would develop strange spots and eventually wither. Since wheat meant bread and bread meant survival, anything that seemed connected to the problem quickly became the enemy. People did not know how fungi worked or how complicated life cycles could be, but they saw enough correlation to draw a simple, harsh conclusion. When barberry grew near wheat, the wheat suffered. That was enough to label the plant as dangerous. In response, laws and local rules began to appear ordering people to rip out barberry bushes, especially near fields. In some regions, you could be fined for keeping them. Whole hillsides were cleared. To modern eyes, it can look like superstition. Strangely, this time the fear was not entirely wrong. The fungus that caused wheat rust did indeed use barberry as part of its life cycle. Medieval farmers with no microscopes and no labs still managed to stumble onto a real connection through simple observation and stubborn pattern tracking. Even under suspicion, barberry never disappeared completely. People still loved the taste. In some villages, you might find a few carefully guarded bushes growing at a distance from the grain fields tucked behind a house or at the edge of a wood. The berries were harvested, quietly turned into sauces, or dried for later medicinal use, and the plant itself was treated a bit like a risky friend, useful but not entirely trusted. Where barberry fell under a shadow, another fruit earned a golden reputation simply because of when it chose to ripen. Nespoli, which many people today know as loquats, offered something incredibly rare in colder climates. They ripened very early at exactly the moment when people were most desperate for fresh food. Imagine a long winter in a stone house. The last stored apples are gone. The cabbages in the cellar are starting to look tired. Dried peas and grain are still there, but anything crisp or juicy feels like a distant memory. Then, as snow begins to shrink and mud takes its place, a tree in the garden suddenly shows clusters of small golden fruits. The skin is thin and slightly fuzzy. Inside is soft, juicy flesh that tastes like a blend of peach mango and citrus. That first bite after months of dry bread and salty stews must have felt like biting into sunlight. Nespoli trees have an unusual rhythm. They flower when many other trees are getting ready to sleep, form tiny fruit before winter, and then patiently hold those fruits through the cold. As temperatures warm, the fruit races ahead of everything else and reaches full ripeness just as the hunger season is at its worst. That strange timing turned the tree into a quiet hero of the early year. The journey of this fruit is a story of travel and trade. It began far away in Asian regions where it had been cultivated for centuries. Traders and travelers carried it slowly west, passing seeds and saplings from one culture to another. By the time it settled into Mediterranean gardens, it felt like an exotic gift. Wealthier estates took to it quickly. The trees looked attractive all year, and the fruit offered both pleasure and status. Serving a bowl of golden loquats to guests early in the year sent a clear message. The household had connections, resources, and skilled gardeners who could coax delicate trees through cold seasons. The uses did not stop with fresh eating. Leaves from the tree were dried and brewed into teas thought to ease coughs and help with breathing problems. Inhaling the steam from a pot scented with Nespoli leaves and honey would have felt soothing on a cold, damp day. In this way, the tree provided sweetness for the table and comfort for the sickbed. From monastery gardens to noble estates and small village plots, these fruits shaped how people in medieval times survived and enjoyed their world. Tart berries that seemed dangerous sour fruits that transformed into delicacies and golden orbs that arrived just in time to break the grip of winter, all had a place in that delicate balance between hunger and abundance. From far beyond the borders of most medieval maps came a fruit that felt almost like it had travelled through time. Jujubes moved along trade routes that crossed deserts, mountains and seas, carried by merchants, monks and wandering traders who swapped silk spices, stories and seeds. By the time these small unassuming fruits arrived in European gardens, they already had a long history behind them. At first glance, a fresh jujube looks like a small, smooth apple. The skin can be greenish or reddish-brown depending on ripeness. Bite into a fresh one, and you get a crisp, lightly sweet taste that feels familiar, almost like an apple mixed with a mild date. Leave that same fruit on the tree or on a drying rack, and it starts to wrinkle and darken, turning chewy and dense with a flavour closer to caramel and honey. This natural shift from crisp to chewy was not a flaw. It was the superpower that made jujubes perfect for a world where preservation meant survival. You did not need sugar-coating smoking or barrels of salt. The fruit slowly dried itself, concentrating its sweetness while keeping enough moisture to feel satisfying. Travellers and pilgrims fell in love with that practicality. Imagine packing for a long journey in the Middle Ages. There are no gas stations, no snack stalls, no vending machines. Your choices are tough, dried meat, rock-hard bread, maybe some nuts, and if you are lucky, a pouch of jujubes. While other foods spoiled fast or became inedible without soaking, jujube stayed friendly. You could eat them fresh at the start of the journey, then chew on the dried ones weeks later, when the landscape had changed and everything in your bag felt tired. Jujubes earned another layer of importance in folk medicine. Healers believed they calmed the mind, soothed the nerves, and helped people sleep. They were boiled into syrups or steeped in hot water to make dark, sweet teas. For someone lying awake in a drafty room, mind racing with worries about harvest, sickness, or war, a warm drink made from jujubes that probably felt like a small, gentle miracle. In busy markets, candy makers saw opportunity too. They sliced and dried the fruit-rolled pieces in honey or sugar and sold them as treats that could sit on a shelf for ages without turning bad. Over time, the word jujube became linked to candies in general, even when those sweets no longer contained any real fruit. The original chewy, naturally sweet little fruit quietly slipped into the background, while its name stuck to bright-coloured candies in jars and paper bags. Beyond the walls of gardens and cities, another fruit tree took on a completely different role, tied not to medicine or snacks, but to one of the most luxurious fabrics on earth. Mulberry trees spread across Europe because of silk. Silk had a kind of magic in the medieval imagination. It was expensive, soft, and almost impossibly smooth compared to wool or linen. Owning silk clothing meant power and money. Rulers, nobles, and wealthy merchants all wanted it. But silk came from silkworms, and silkworms came with one extremely strict rule: they would only eat mulberry leaves. That single fact shaped landscapes. If a region wanted to join the silk trade, it needed mulberry trees and lots of them. Landowners planted them along field edges, roads, and around estates. In some places, laws demanded that anyone with a certain amount of land had to plant a specific number of mulberry trees. Cutting one down without good reason could bring fines or trouble, because every missing tree meant fewer leaves and fewer silkworms. You can imagine hillsides dotted with white or black mulberry trees, their leaves fluttering in the breeze while workers carefully tended silkworms in nearby buildings. Inside trays filled with wriggling caterpillars would be piled up in shelves, each tray piled with freshly picked mulberry leaves. The rustling of thousands of tiny mouths chewing was said to sound like soft rain. All that effort, all that planting, all that leaf picking was aimed at one goal: shimmering threads that would eventually become garments, banners, or religious vestments. Mulberry trees were in a sense machinery in a living factory, but the story of mulberries did not end with the worms. The trees also produced berries by the handful, dark and juicy, somewhere between a blackberry and a raspberry in flavour, but with their own deep wine-like richness. For people who spent so much time caring for the leaves, the fruit felt like an extra reward. Mulberries ripen gradually over several weeks instead of all at once. That meant steady picking rather than a single overwhelming harvest day. For families and workers, this slowly unfolding supply of berries was a real gift. You could eat them fresh straight from the branch fingers stained purple, or bring them into the kitchen for more careful use. Cooks turned mulberries into thick jams and syrups, boiled them into rich sauces for meats, and fermented their juice into wine or cordials. Mulberry wine was sweet, dark and strong, a kind of bottled summer that could cut through winter gloom. A simple clay mug filled with this drink on a cold evening probably felt like a warm blanket in liquid form. There was also a more delicate use for the fruit that many people never think about. The juice worked well as a dye and a kind of natural ink. When mixed with the other ingredients, it could be used to write or draw. Some manuscripts and documents likely owe their faded but still visible letters to mulberry-based ink. The same fruit that stained mouths and hands in the orchard left traces on parchment that outlasted the trees themselves. Mulberry wood had its role too. It could be turned into sturdy tools, small pieces of furniture, or carved objects. When a tree got old or stopped producing well, nothing went to waste. The trunk and branches became fuel and material. The roots fed future crops as they rotted. The cycle reset itself when a new sapling was planted nearby. There is something quietly impressive about the way this one kind of tree sat at the centre of so many activities. Branched highways of trade and wealth ran through silk. Daily life brought people to the berries. The workshop and the writing desk used its wood and juice. Every part of the mulberry tree connected to some human need, from luxury to survival. In fields, in gardens, and in workrooms, these fruit-bearing trees shaped habits and economies in ways that are easy to miss at first glance. A bowl of jujubes on a shelf and a row of mulberries along a road do not look like engines of history, but they powered journeys, industries, and small comforts that helped people endure a hard and unpredictable world. Far from royal courts and city markets, another little fruit quietly kept whole communities going through brutal seasons. The Saskatoon berry did not look like much at first glance. It was small blue-purple and easy to confuse with a blueberry. The real magic was inside. These berries carried more than sweetness. They packed in protein, healthy fats, and serious fibre, which made them feel closer to a tiny portable meal than a simple snack. Daily life could be exhausting. People working the land from dawn to dusk burned through thousands of calories just trying to survive ordinary chores. There were no energy bars in shiny wrappers. A handful of Saskatoon berries tucked into a cloth pouch was the medieval version of a power-up. Eat a few, and you got a slow, steady release of energy that did not vanish after half an hour. For Indigenous communities and later settlers, these berries were not just a treat, they were a foundation. Berries were mixed with dried meat and fat to make dense travel and survival food. That mixture could last for months and still provide real nutrition. In hard winters, when fields lay buried under snow, and game grew scarce, jars and bags of dried Saskatoon berries could mean the difference between hunger and endurance. Monasteries and remote villages appreciated another crucial trait. Saskatoon bushes were stubborn. Even when frosts damaged other fruit crops, these bushes often bounced back and produced a harvest. In a year when apples failed and plums dropped early, the Saskatoon plant still offered clusters of berries. That reliability made them incredibly valuable, especially in places that were far from trade routes. If storms or conflict cut off outside supplies, people could still count on these quiet shrubs. Preserving them was simple. The berries could be spread on racks or laid out on clean rock in the sun until most of the moisture disappeared. Once dried, they shrank into dark little beads of concentrated nutrition. Stored in clay jars or leather bags, they remained edible for months or even years. Old storerooms often held a hidden shelf or corner where jars of dried berries waited as emergency reserves for bad years. When harvests went well, people did not limit themselves to survival recipes. Cooks experimented. Saskatoon berries appeared in pies, stews, and sweetbreads. They were simmered with honey into thick spreads and boiled with water to make simple drinks. The high natural sugar content made them perfect for fermentation. Wines and cordials made from these berries turned out rich and strong, ideal for a cold night by the fire. Drinking songs and jokes sometimes warned about the strength of Saskatoon wine. It was the kind of drink that felt friendly at first, and then suddenly reminded you that it had more power than expected. After a long day of work in icy wind, a cup or two of this dark, sweet liquid felt like a shortcut to warmth and singing, even if your feet were still wrapped in worn boots and your breath smoked in the air. Not every important fruit earned its place through nutrition. Some were planted for reasons that had more to do with fear and faith than calories. The rowan tree is a perfect example. People planted rowan not just for its bright red berries, but because they believed it protected them from things they could not see. The tree itself was graceful and unassuming. In summer, it wore clusters of white flowers that later turned into bunches of red berries. Those berries glowed like little lanterns against the dark green leaves. For many communities that glow meant safety. Branches of rowan wood were hung above doors or over stable entrances, especially during celebrations or times people thought were spiritually risky. Walking sticks carved from rowan became trusted companions on dark roads. Travellers believed that a staff made from this wood could protect them from malevolent forces in lonely forests or on empty paths. The small star shape at the base of each berry looked like a tiny carved symbol, so people saw it as a natural mark of protection stamped by the tree itself. There was a practical side to the berries too. Raw, they were shockingly bitter. Birds often refused to touch them until frost softened the taste. People learned the same lesson. No one enjoyed them straight off the branch, but once frost hit, the fruit became more manageable. Cooks discovered that boiling and sweetening transformed the harsh berries into something genuinely delicious. Rowan berry jam thickened easily because the fruit contained plenty of natural gelling agents. That made it perfect for preserves. A pot of rowan jam added tart brightness to heavy winter meals. Stirring a spoonful into porridge turned a plain bowl of grain into something colourful and flavourful. Families could line shelves with jars of deep orange-red jelly that lasted through the cold season. In the far north, the health benefits were another quiet advantage. These little berries contained a lot of vitamin C, which helped ward off diseases that came from a lack of fresh produce. In regions where winters were long and dark, scurvy was a real threat. A spoonful of rowan jam might not have looked like medicine, but it did more for the body than many fancy mixtures sold by healers. For those who wanted something stronger, the berries also went into fermentation. Distillers turned them into fiery schnapps that burned on the way down and warmed the chest. People believed it could ease sore throats, loosen stiff joints, and push out colds. The logic was simple. If it felt like your throat was on fire, something inside must be getting chased away. While rowan trees stood as guardians near homes and roads, another plant armed itself with thorns and a completely different kind of fruit. Blackthorn bushes spread along property lines, forming dense, twisted hedges. The branches were wickedly sharp, even livestock learned quickly not to push against them. These living fences kept animals in and intruders out better than many wooden structures. Hidden among the spikes were small dark blue fruits called sloes. At first taste they seemed like a mistake. Pop one in your mouth and the intense sourness and dryness made it feel like your whole face wanted to fold in on itself. The fruit was full of tannins which gave a gripping, almost chalky effect on the tongue. Eaten raw, it was more punishment than pleasure, yet people harvested them with enthusiasm. Baskets of sloes came back from fields and hedgerows every autumn because cooks and brewers had learned a secret. Sloes were perfect for infusing into alcohol. Prick the skins, cover them with a strong spirit, add a little sweetener and let time do its work. Over months, the harshness faded and the liquid turned a rich reddish colour. The flavour became deep fruity and slightly almond-like with a smooth warmth that was perfect in cold weather. For households that could not afford complicated imported ingredients, this was a simple way to create a special drink. The recipe did not require expensive tools or rare spices. It needed patience, clean containers, and access to hedgerows. Many families had all three. Bottles appeared in cupboards or on shelves, waiting for festivals, births, marriages, or any excuse to pour a glass and celebrate. Blackthorn wood had another life outside the kitchen. Its hardness made it excellent for sturdy sticks and clubs. Walking sticks carved from blackthorn became trusted tools for travellers and guards. For some people, a blackthorn staff was both a walking aid and an emergency weapon that fit naturally in the hand. The combination of practical fencing, useful weapons, and rich infused drinks made this plant a quiet giant in rural life. A single hedge could protect animals, flavour spirits, and supply medicine, because slow tonics were also used to treat stomach troubles and fevers. On top of that, the berries, like many wild fruits, provided much-needed vitamins when cooked and preserved. These stories of Saskatoon bushes loaded with survival food, rowan trees guarding doorways, and blackthorn hedges hiding powerful little fruits show how deeply woven these plants were into everyday existence. Each one filled multiple roles. They were pantry, pharmacy, fence fuel, and folklore all at once. In noisy taverns and quiet village squares, one particular fruit slipped into drink so often that it left its fingerprints on the place names. The checker fruit from the wild service tree became so tied to ale that many pubs eventually took their names from it. Walk into an inn called the Checkers, and you are stepping into the legacy of a small speckled fruit that once flavoured some of the most popular drinks in town. Checker fruits were not especially glamorous to look at. They were small, brownish, and marked with pale spots that gave them a faint checkered pattern. Fresh from the tree, they were far from delicious. Like medlars and some other fruits of that era, they needed time to soften and sweeten. People would spread them out and let them partially over-ripen. This controlled softening turned harsh tannins into gentle sugars, creating a complex taste that worked beautifully in brewing. Aloe in that period was not about novelty flavours or fancy branding. It was a daily drink, safer than much of the water and important as a source of calories. That did not mean people were content with bland barrels. Brewers searched for small ways to improve flavour and shelf life without spending a fortune on imported spices. Checker fruits answered both needs. When added to ale, they lent a faint tang and a hint of dried fruit character. At the same time, the tannins in the fruit helped preserve the drink a little longer. For tavern keepers, this was a serious advantage. A barrel that stayed good for an extra stretch meant less waste and more reliable profit. A drink that tasted distinctive could build loyalty. Locals would return to the place that served checker-flavoured ale. the one that did not spoil too quickly and left a pleasant aftertaste. In a world without modern refrigeration that counted as a competitive edge, villages often had a single wild service tree that everyone knew by sight. It might stand near the market, by the tavern yard, or at the edge of a green. When fruit season arrived, people would gather to collect the checkers, knowing that the harvest would influence how the ale tasted for months. Children ran around under the branches while adults filled baskets and sacks. The whole process felt like a small yearly festival built around a tree. This sense of shared ownership sometimes translated into custom. The fruit from a particular tree might be reserved for a specific tavern, or split between several households by tradition. The tree itself gained a quiet status, not for shade or beauty, but for the way its fruit trickled into mugs and conversations, warming faces and loosening tongues after long days. Where checker, fruits-flavoured drink in crowded rooms, another tough little fruit supported travellers out on lonely roads. Hackberries grew on trees that could handle conditions many plants would not survive. Dry summers, poor soil and rough winds did not scare them. They sank deep roots and held on. The fruits were small and sweet with a thin outer skin and a crunchy inner portion that contained fat, carbohydrates and protein. That unusual mix made them ideal for survival food. People could eat a handful and feel not just a burst of sugar, but longer-lasting fullness. For someone walking through rocky passes or crossing empty plains that mattered far more than showy flavour, dried hackberries became staples in travel kits. Hunters, messengers, and wandering herders carried them in pouches and bags. Combining the dried fruit with ground grain or nuts produced dense, compact rations that resisted spoilage. A fragment of one of these cakes might not look impressive, but it could keep a person going for hours of hard effort. Communities in difficult climates sometimes planted hackberry trees near wells, crossroads, and gathering spots as a living guarantee against famine. When other crops withered, the trees often still produced. People could climb or knock down the fruit dry, grind it and stretch limited supplies of flour or other ingredients. That versatility made hackberries less of a sec and more of a quiet insurance policy growing overhead. While hackberries were sturdy and common in harsher landscapes, there were fruits that leaned toward the rare and mysterious. Mespilus, a relative of the medlar, occupied that role. Even in the period when many strange fruits still had a place in ordinary life, this one felt unusual. The fruit looked like it had been designed by someone who could not make up their mind. Round overall, but with a star-shaped pattern at the blossom end and a muted brown colour that suggested it had been left in the shade too long. To people used to bright red apples and glowing plums, it seemed almost eerie. Some descriptions from the time even hint that people found it unsettling before they tasted it. Cultivating Mespilus was not simple. The tree wanted specific conditions and careful attention. It did not grow everywhere. Monasteries with dedicated gardeners and estates with specialized orchards were more likely to maintain it. The difficulty of raising it turned the fruit into a subtle status symbol. Serving it at a feast sent a message that the hosts had land patience and skilled workers. Like several of its cousins, Mespilus needed to soften after harvest. Hard, unripe flesh mellowed into something completely different when allowed to rest. The interior developed a flavour that witnesses compared to honey mixed with wine and gentle spice. It slid easily into expensive desserts served in high society. Combined with fine pastry nuts or cream, it became a dessert that spoke of winter luxury in great halls glowing with torchlight. In small villages, very few people would ever taste Mespilus. It lived mostly in the culinary world of the wealthy. There is a striking contrast between a rare fruit appearing on golden platters in echoing halls and a simple hackberry being chewed by someone trudging through snow with a bundle on their back. Both came from trees, Both were part of the same era, yet their paths reflected the deep divides between different layers of that society. At the opposite end of the glamour scale stood the crabapple. Hardy, stubborn and sharp, tasting it earned its place not by being rare, but by being relentlessly useful. Wild crabapple trees clung to hillsides lined trackways and dotted open land. The fruits were small, often sour enough to make jaws clench, and not many people wanted to eat them raw. Despite that, they became central to many kitchens and workshops. Crab apples contain a lot of acid and natural pectin. That combination makes them perfect for turning into jellies, pastes, and thick sauces. When boiled with sugar or honey, they transformed from harsh little marbles into glowing bright preserves that set firmly and kept for long stretches. Cooks blended crab apple preparations with richer, fattier ingredients to strike a balance in flavour and texture. Meat dishes gained from the pairing. A spoonful of crab apple sauce next to roasted pork or goose cut through fat and lifted the whole meal. The strong tart flavour could stand up against smoky, heavy proteins and survive the fire-driven cooking style of the time. In many households, jars of crab apple jelly were as important as barrels of grain or sacks of salt. Pressing and fermenting the juice led to powerful ciders. These drinks might be too intense for a modern sweet tooth, but they stored well and delivered warmth along with calories. For people in cold regions, a sharp crab apple cider in a thick mug by a hearth made life feel bearable during howling winds. The usefulness of crab apples stretched beyond food and drink. The wood from the trees was dense with a fine grain. Craftspeople turned it into tool handles, small carved items and pieces that needed to withstand stress. The same tree that scattered sharp tasting fruits under its branches also supplied handles for axes and mallets or pegs for building. All these different fruits formed a kind of toolbox that medieval communities reached into according to season, need and opportunity. Some brought comfort at feasts, some paid debts in the form of scented drinks, some kept bellies full on long journeys, and some sat quietly in hedgerows until someone with patience transformed them in a kitchen or a cellar. Picture a medieval village waking up on a cool late summer morning. Smoke curls lazily from chimneys, chickens scratch at the dirt, and the air smells like damp earth and baking bread. The weekly market is about to start. Carts creak into the square and people set up rough wooden tables or simply spread cloths on the ground. If you walked through that scene with a careful eye, you would start to see how all these forgotten fruits actually work together across the year. At one end, an older woman might be stacking small jars filled with the deep red or dark purple preserves. She has cornelian cherry syrup in squat clay pots, sharp and bright for soothing fevers. Next to it, thick mulberry jam glows like bottled sunset ready to spread on coarse bread. There is a pot of rowan jelly that looks almost like amber, promising a tart kick for cold months and a quiet shield against scurvy. To her, these are not fancy products. They are stored sunlight carefully captured in sugar and clay. Across the square, a farmer is unloading sacks of hard, knobbly fruit. If you look closer, you see that they are not meant to be eaten yet. The service fruits are still firm, the medlars are still pale. He spread them in layers of straw in a cool corner of his barn, knowing that weeks from now they will turn soft and sweet. The work he is doing today will become desserts and sauces when snow covers the ground. Nearby, a monk from a local monastery has brought it a few baskets from the garden inside the walls. His table looks modest. A bowl of fresh jujubes still crisp and shiny. A small pile of cornelian cherries so ripe they almost bruise at a touch. Some dried loquat slices that look like bits of golden leather. For every piece of fruit he has a story. This one helps restless sleepers. That one calms a cough. Those leaves brew into a tea that soothes tight lungs on cold, damp days. People trade coins, eggs, or even simple chores for these quiet remedies, trusting in long practice more than in written recipes. At another stall, the air smells different. There are no fresh fruits on display, just earthenware jugs, wooden cups, and a few carefully labelled barrels. The cider maker stands behind them like a conductor in front of the instruments. One barrel holds sharp crab-apple cider that bites the tongue and wakes you up. Another contains a golden drink made with regular apples rounded out by sorb apples, each sip deeper and more layered. A third holds a darker brew flavoured with checker fruits with a faint taste of dried dates and raisins. People do not ask about tannins or sugar profiles. They ask how strong it is, whether it keeps well, and whether it tastes like last year or better. The cider maker might casually mention that the sorb harvest was smaller but the fruits were richer, or that the wild service tree near the tavern gave a bigger crop of checkers, so this year the ale has more of that familiar tang. Small shifts in the weather and fruit trees become part of the village gossip as much as births or arguments. A little away from the main square, children are climbing a hedgerow hands stained dark from mulberries and sloes. The mulberries go straight into mouths or into baskets for pies and wine. The sloes get collected more carefully. Adults remind the children not to eat them raw. They know that those harsh little fruits are destined for bottles of slow-infused spirits that will be opened when the days are short and guests need something strong to share stories over. In the distance, beyond the houses and fields, stand a few trees that no one casually touches. A tall service tree with rough bark and a graceful crown marks one boundary. It is actually listed in someone's will promised to a particular family. The fruit from that tree is already spoken for, even if half the children in the village climb it for fun. A rowan tree stands by the main road, its berries glowing red. People touch the trunk when leaving on long journeys, a quiet gesture asking for safety. Its berries will end up as jam and schnapps, but its presence also calms fears that have nothing to do with hunger. If you follow a group of travellers leaving that village, you see yet another side of these fruits at work. On a narrow dirt road, a small caravan stops beneath a hackberry tree. People take a few minutes to rest, refill water skins and dig into their bags. Someone pulls out a pouch of dried hackberries and shares them around. Another brings out a cake made from ground Saskatoon berries mixed with fat and meat hard as a plank but full of energy. Someone else has a cloth bundle of dried jujubes, chewy and sweet, that taste better with every passing mile. None of these foods look impressive. There are no bright labels, no metal wrappers, no fancy shapes. Yet they keep people walking through heat and cold across long distances where no fresh food grows. They slip into saddlebags, pockets and belts, quietly fueling trade pilgrimages and migrations. Back at home in a small stone house with a sagging roof, the fruit year unfolds like a quiet calendar. In early spring, loquats are the first to appear, bringing fresh juice to mouths tired of salted meat and stale bread. Later, the cornelian cherries redden, bringing medicine and sharp preserves. Summer fills trees with mulberries, crab apples, Saskatoon berries and hackberries. These are devoured fresh, then dried, boiled, pressed and fermented before they can spoil. As autumn creeps in, sloes darken and rowan berries turn from green to blazing red. The last of the jujubes wrinkle and dry on the branch. The barberries glow like droplets of bright sourness on thorny bushes waiting to cut through rich stews. Inside storerooms, baskets of hard service fruits and medlars sit quietly on their way to becoming edible through slow change. Winter arrives and yet there is still fruit on the table, though much of it no longer looks like what it once was. All of this depends on memory and skill. Someone in the household knows exactly when to harvest sloes so they are not too harsh. Someone knows how long to leave medlars on straw before they reach that perfect stage. Someone knows how far to plant barberry from wheat, not for scientific reasons, but because the stories say it is safer that way. Knowledge is passed not through printed labels, but through stories told while stirring pots, pruning branches, or walking children past hedges and trees. These forgotten fruits show how closely people once watched the world around them. Every small change in leaf colour, fruit, texture, or ripening time mattered. A fruit that could store for months, a berry that kept its vitamins in dried form, a tree whose leaves fed silkworms while its fruit filled pies. All of these details made life more livable in a time when failure at planning could mean real hunger. Looked at closely, the medieval fruit basket was not a collection of odd curiosities. It was a carefully built system. Some fruits were there to comfort, some to heal, some to preserve drink, some to carry travellers forward, and some to act as living savings accounts in the form of trees. Each one played a role that made sense in that world of hard work, limited resources and seasons that ruled everything. Imagine standing in the middle of a modern supermarket staring at the fruit section. Shiny apples lined up by colour, bananas in perfect yellow curves, oranges stacked into bright pyramids. Everything looks clean and standardised, almost like a showroom. If a medieval farmer walked into that space, they would probably be impressed for about 5 seconds, then confused at how small the fruit universe has become. For them, fruit was not just red, green and citrus. It was a whole spectrum of odd shapes, tricky ripening schedules and complicated flavours. The strange thing is not that medieval people ate these 15 fruits. The strange thing is how almost all of them vanished from everyday life. Several forces quietly pushed these plants out of the picture. The first force was convenience. Medieval fruit culture rewarded patience and knowledge. You needed to know that medlars and service fruits had to sit for weeks softening in straw before they tasted good. You had to remember that sloes improved after frost, that barberries should not grow near wheat, and that some trees took 30 years to finally deliver their best crop. That kind of slow relationship with plants fits a world where generations stay on the same land and small differences in harvest timing matter. Later, as agriculture industrialized, patience turned into a liability. Farmers started to favour fruits that could be shipped long distances without bruising, harvested all at once with predictable timing, and sold to people who had never heard of bletting. A hard, glossy apple that can sit in cold storage for weeks without changing became more profitable than a fragile little fruit that looks rotten when it is finally ready. The second force was standardization. Markets and later supermarkets needed things that could be sorted and labelled easily. A row of identical apples is simple. A mix of crab apples, service fruits, and sorb apples in different sizes and textures is complicated. Breeders and growers focused on varieties that produced uniform, good-looking fruit, rather than intense but unusual flavours. Over time, the wild and half-wild trees at the edges of fields were cut down or ignored, and their place was taken by rows of predictable cultivars. The third force was forgetfulness. Knowledge about these fruits lived mostly in people, not on paper. A grandmother knew exactly how to judge a medlar by touch. A village brewer knew how many checker fruits to add to a barrel. A monk knew the right way to dry Saskatoon berries so they kept their strength. When those people died without passing on their skills, the plants themselves were suddenly less useful. A tree is only valuable if someone remembers what to do with it. Wars, plagues, and migrations also played their part. When people fled, they did not always bring graft seeds or the memory of obscure recipes. Land changed hands. New owners cut down old trees for timber or cleared hedgerows to enlarge fields. Trade routes shifted, and with them the flow of loquats, jujubes, and other travellers. Little by little, the fruit landscape flattened. There were also new competitors. Sugar imports increased over time, making it easier to create sweet foods without relying on complex fruit flavours. Once refined sugar became cheaper, people could bake cakes, candies, and puddings that did not depend on that one tree in the corner of a field. Bottled alcohol produced in larger operations slowly replaced homemade ciders and fruit infusions. Checker-flavoured ale and slow-soaked spirits faded in favour of drinks with more consistent taste. Despite all that, the story is not entirely one way. Many of these fruits still exist, hanging on in scraps of woodland, old estates, forgotten monastery gardens, and rare orchards cared for by enthusiasts. A person walking down a narrow lane might see a twisted tree heavy with tiny apples and never realise that they are looking at a crabapple that once helped feed a village. A small shriveled brown fruit under a hedge could be a medlar from a self-seeded tree that nobody harvests anymore. The idea of bringing these fruits back is not just nostalgic. Each one carries qualities that modern food systems often need. Saskatoon berries and hackberries pack nutrition into small spaces, perfect for people who want powerful food with minimal processing. Sorb apples and crab apples bring natural tannins and acids that can replace some chemical additives in brewing and preserving. Cornelian cherries and rowan berries carry vitamins and organic acids that support health in ways pills cannot fully mimic. There is also a flavour argument. Once you get used to supermarket fruit, everything starts to taste slightly similar. Wheat may be a little tart, but rarely surprising. Medlars with their wine and spice notes, sloes with their wild bitterness transformed by time, and jujubes with their shift from crisp to caramel chewiness offer experiences that stand out. For cooks, bartenders, and bakers who dream of new combinations, these fruits are like hidden tools in a toolbox that most people have forgotten even exists. Imagine a small farm today deciding to rebuild a medieval-style fruit corner. Along one boundary, blackthorn and rowan form a hedge that doubles as fence and pantry. Behind them stand a couple of service trees, a wild service for checkers and a medlar. Between them grows a mulberry that feeds children and birds all summer. In a sheltered spot near a building wall, a loquat tree spreads its branches, offering early golden fruit when winter is just loosening its grip. The owner of that farm could sell Saskatoon berries as heritage superfood, offer sloe gin, flavoured with wild sloes picked from the hedge, and lay out slices of fresh jujubes at tasting so people can experience the change from crisp to chewy over time. Jars of dark mulberry jam, bright barberry sauce for roasted vegetables, and spiced medlar paste could line a wooden shelf at a weekend market. A sign might say something like, "Old World Fruits for New World Kitchens." For viewers who like to think in terms of niche, there is an entire content and product niche hidden in these plants. Gardeners who want something beyond the usual apple and pear trees can dedicate a corner to experimental medieval fruits. Home brewers can play with sorb apples, crab apples, sloes and checkers to recreate or reinvent drinks that feel older than the history books. Slow living and homesteading communities can adopt service trees and hackberries as symbols of long-term planning and resilience. Even without planting anything, people can start by learning to recognize some of these fruits in the wild. Many countries still have hedges full of blackthorn, with sloes quietly ripening in the shade. Old manor grounds sometimes hold mulberry trees, planted centuries ago for silk that never took off. Village lanes might hide a service tree that no one has paid attention to in decades. Taking the time to identify them is a first step toward bringing their stories and flavours back into ordinary life. There is a kind of quiet rebellion in that effort. Modern systems encourage fast reward, instant ripeness, and year-round uniformity. Fruits like medlars say the opposite. Wait, watch, let time change this. Trust a process that looks wrong at first glance but ends up being exactly right. Service trees and hackberries speak about planting for children and grandchildren, not for the next quarter. Rowan and mulberry remind people that beauty myth, practicality and taste can live on a single branch. Standing at the edge of an old field with wind pushing through rough grass and a hedge whispering with leaves, it is not hard to imagine how important this mix of fruit once was. It was never only about eating. It was about medicine, trade, ceremony, protection, survival, and celebration. Reintroducing these fruits does more than diversify a menu. It reconnects people with a way of seeing the natural world as a partner filled with odd, sometimes difficult, but deeply generous gifts. Think for a moment about what it would actually feel like to taste these fruits with a modern tongue that has grown up on supermarket sweetness. Someone cuts open a bletted medlar and hands you a spoon. The skin looks wrinkled and almost bruised. Instinct says this belongs in a compost bin, not on a plate. You take a cautious bite. Instead of rot, you get warmth. Thick, smooth pulp slides across your tongue with the richness of spiced apple butter mixed with dried dates. There's a faint hint of red wine, a little earthiness, and a soft sweetness that feels calmer than white sugar. You expect to flinch. Instead, you want another spoonful. Next, someone pours a small glass of cider made with sorb apples. At first glance, it just looks like a rustic drink, a bit cloudy, the colour of golden amber, with a reddish glow when it catches the light. The first sip tells a different story. It starts with a sharp apple snap, then deepens into a slightly bitter, almost tea-like dryness that lingers. Another sip brings out something else, a ghost of dried fruit, a little tang that keeps the drink from ever feeling flat. You realise quickly why farmers could use this as tax payment. It is more than a thirst quencher. It is a crafted flavour that makes plain water seem very dull. Now imagine someone putting two fruits in front of you on a wooden board. One is a perfectly red supermarket apple that could have been grown anywhere. The other is a small knobbly crab apple sour enough to make a child suspicious. Bite the big one, and it tastes exactly like you expect. Safe, sweet, consistent. Bite the crab apple, and the first impression is intense. Teeth gripping acidity, sharp corners of flavour. On its own, it might be too much. But imagine the energy poured into jelly that clings to meat or into cider that warms your chest on a cold night. Suddenly, the aggressive little fruit makes sense. Move to the section of the table that holds berries and small fruits. A shallow bowl is filled with fresh Saskatoon berries. You pick one up and pop it into your mouth. It looks like a blueberry, but it tastes deeper. The sweetness carries a faint note of almond and plum. Chew slowly and you notice that it feels more substantial. Not just juice and skin, but something that makes your body feel like it has actually eaten, not just snacked. Another bowl holds dried Saskatoon berries. Those chew like tiny bits of flavoured leather, intense and long-lasting. You can easily imagine someone walking all day with a pouch full of them. On another plate sit glossy red cornelian cherries. Some are fresh, some are cooked into a thick syrup. A raw one tastes tart and assertive, a bit like a very intense cranberry with less bitterness. The syrup version feels like medicine disguised as dessert. Sweet but not cloying, with a clean, sharp edge that cuts through tiredness. You take a sip and can understand why monks treasured these for the sick. Your throat feels soothed and your mind feels a little more awake. A small jar holds barberries steeped with herbs. You taste one and your mouth lights up with bright, piercing sourness. It is not subtle. It hits quickly, then fades, leaving room for whatever it is paired with. Imagine this dropped into stews full of heavy root vegetables and greasy meat. The effect would be like opening a window in a smoky room. Then you look at a row of darker, stranger fruits and preparations. At one end is a bottle of slow-infused spirit. The liquid is deep reddish purple. A cautious sip tells you why people went to the trouble of pricking tiny berries and waiting months. The drink is smooth and warming, with fruit character that feels like plum and almond blended together. It is strong but not harsh. 2 sips in, cheeks relax and shoulders drop. The surrounding conversations in your imaginary tavern start to sound funnier. Near that stands a simple clay mug of mulberry wine. It is sweeter and a bit thicker, with the flavour of ripe berries and a hint of wood. You can taste summer hedgerows in it. You understand why people used mulberry juice as both a drink and an ink. It leaves a faint stain on your lips, just like it left marks on parchment. At another corner of the table lies a wooden tray holding a sliced loquat, a few fresh jujubas and some dried ones. The loquat segment is juicy and bright, tasting like a mix of peach and citrus. It feels like the first warm day after a long winter. The fresh jujube is crisp, mild and sweet, almost like a pear crossed with an apple. The dried one, on the other hand, is chewy, comforting and caramel-like. Eating it feels closer to nibbling on a soft date dipped in honey. Next to these sits a pale bowl of tiny wrinkled fruits that most guests would walk past without a second glance. These are checkers. Someone invites you to try one that has been allowed to soften properly. The flavour is mild at first, then deepens into a mix of baked apple raisin and a touch of malt. It is easy to imagine this flavour slipping gently into ale and changing it from simple liquid bread into something with character. Hackberries appear in another dish, mashed and mixed with ground grain in a simple cake. Take a bite and you do not get impressive flavour, but you do feel how dense it is. It sits in the stomach like a trustworthy friend. Not heavy in a bad way, but solid. Your body understands quickly that this is efficient fuel. In a small, carefully carved cup sits a spoonful of mespilus paste made from fruit that took years of cultivation and weeks of softening to become edible. The texture is silky. The taste is subtle sweetness mixed with faint spice and a touch of floral honey. It is not as showy as some of the other flavours, but it lingers. It feels like the kind of dessert served quietly to important guests. Everywhere on this imaginary tasting table the same pattern appears. These fruits rarely offer easy instant sweetness. Almost all of them ask for an extra step. Wait for frost, let them rest, boil them down, steep them in alcohol, dry them under sun, mix them with something else. There is always a process that turns rough, sour or inedible beginnings into something rich and valuable. That extra step mirrors the lives that shaped them. Medieval daily reality was full of things that needed patience and transformation. Grain had to be milled, dough had to rise, wool had to be spun, and woven leather had to be tanned. Apprentices had to be trained. People were used to waiting, watching, and trusting that effort now would bring reward later. These fruits fit into the hat mindset perfectly. Seen from that angle, the disappearance of so many of them says something about changes that go beyond farming techniques. A world that expects quick results is less friendly to fruit that ripens on its own schedule or looks ugly when it is ready. A culture that values convenience will not rush to plant a tree that only begins to pay off when its planter is old. Reimagining these fruits in a modern context means more than adding new flavours to a menu. It means deciding that time and complexity can be part of pleasure again. It means planting something not just for yourself, but for whoever comes after. It means remembering that some of the most interesting tastes come from things that would look like mistakes to someone who only shops for perfect shine and uniform colour. A small urban garden could easily hold a mulberry that stains fingers every summer, a rowan that lights up autumn with red berries, and a blackthorn hedge that feeds birds and fills bottles. Even a single medlar tree on a suburban street could become a conversation starter, when neighbours see strange brown fruits left to soften in a basket instead of being thrown away. At a deeper level, there is a quiet story in every one of these plants about resilience. They survived cold seasons and hard soils, they rode along with migrating people and travelling traders. They adapted to slopes, hedges and neglected corners. Even now, many of them still grow in places that no one has tended for years. Finding them, tasting them, and giving them room again is a way of saying that difficult, unusual things still have a place in a world that often prefers easy repetition. Taken together, these medieval fruits invite anyone listening to look at the landscape differently. A thorny hedge might hide flavour. A gnarled old tree might hold history on its branches. A small sour berry might be one step away from becoming a winter medicine or a celebration drink. The only real requirement is a willingness to pay close attention, to experiment, and to give time a chance to do what it has always done for people who are willing to trust it. Picture growing up in a small medieval village where the calendar is not something hanging on a wall, but something growing on branches. You would not think of the year as 12 printed months. You would remember it as a series of colours, smells, and flavours. Golden loquat time, mulberry-stained summer, rowan red days near the end of harvest, slow-picking afternoons when the hedges were full of dark blue berries and cold wind made fingers sting. As a child, you might not know the names of every saint or every noble, but you would know exactly where the tastiest fruit tree stood. You would know which service tree dropped its fruit into the tall grass by the creek. You would learn that the wild service near the tavern had smaller but sweeter checkers. You would know which mulberry branches you could climb without getting yelled at, and which medlar tree was guarded by an older farmer who did not appreciate uninvited testers. Games and small rituals grew naturally around these trees and shrubs. Children would dare one another to bite a slow straight from the branch and try not to make a face. Someone would always fail and pull a twisted grimace that made everyone else laugh until they fell over. There might be contests to see who could spot the first flash of red on the rowan berries or the first fully ripe cluster of Saskatoon berries at the edge of the field. The winner could claim bragging rights for the day, or demand a share of someone else's bread at lunch. Seasonal celebrations often included quiet fruit traditions tucked between the bigger ceremonies. On certain feast days, people might carry branches of rowan or hackberry into the house and set them near the hearth, half for decoration and half for protection. Harvest time might involve bringing baskets of mixed fruits to a shared table in the village square, not as the main offering, but as the bright, sweet pieces that soften the work of counting grain and weighing taxes. The fruits became emotional markers. The year did not just move from spring to summer, it moved from early loquats to mulberries to sloes and medlars. Inside large houses and castles, the relationship with fruit looked very different, but it still mattered. Wealthy households could afford gardeners who experimented with rare species like Mespilus loquats and unusual varieties of jujube. High-status guests at a banquet might be given delicate plates of carefully arranged fruit at the end of a heavy meal. A slice of Mespilus dessert, a spoonful of spiced medlar paste, or a cluster of candied jujubes signalled sophistication. Serving these was a way to show off connections to faraway lands and the skill of the kitchen. There was a quiet hierarchy even among fruits. A crab-apple jelly on thick bread might appear on the tables of workers and servants, while the softest, most carefully prepared medlars and Mespilus pastes would travel upward to the Lord's table. Yet sometimes the same tree fed both worlds. The noble family might eat delicate desserts, flavoured with a certain fruit, while leftover pulp or slightly damaged pieces still found their way into simpler dishes in the servants' quarters. A single tree could bridge social classes without anyone thinking much about it. Festivals involving drink further tied these fruits into the rhythm of community life. When barrels of new cider or ale were tapped flavoured with sorb apples, crab apples, checkers or mulberries, it was not just about getting tipsy. It was about tasting the success or failure of a year. A good drink meant the weather had been kind, the harvest strong, and the trees generous. A thin, bland drink told its own story about frost storms or disease. People joked, sang, and danced with cups in their hands, but behind the laughter sat a deep awareness that these flavors were the liquid form of their luck. On the edges of gatherings, you can imagine elders telling stories that attached meaning to the plants themselves. Perhaps a grandmother would tell children that rowan trees watched over houses and should never be cut down without apology. Someone might repeat a tale about a blackthorn hedge that once stopped raiders, its dense thorns slowing horses and men long enough for villagers to escape. A monk might explain that cornelian cherries were a gift given to help heal fevers in hard winters. These stories did not need to be historically precise. They worked because they wrapped knowledge in memory and emotion. Those stories helped people remember practical rules. Do not plant barberry too close to wheat fields. Do not pick medlars too early. Do not bother with sloes before the cold has touched them. Do not tear down the rowan on the hill because it stands between the village and bad luck. In a world without printed instructions, superstition and wisdom often walked in step. Fruit represented more than calories. It carried warnings, blessings, and teaching in every season. For someone travelling through different regions, the fruit landscape also served as a kind of living map. In one valley you might see endless mulberries, signs of a community tied to silk production. In another you would notice more hackberries and saskatoon bushes indicating harsher conditions and a focus on survival foods. Around some monasteries, rows of cornelian cherries and loquat would mark a place where healing and study were central. Even without reading a single sign, a traveller could read the land through its fruit trees. These quiet markers also created a sense of local pride. A village might be known for particularly good crab apples or for a hedge that produced unusually flavourful sloes. Another place might boast about its ancient service tree that had stood since anyone could remember. Local nicknames and sayings grew around these plants. Children learned them along with the names of streams and fields. Being from that place meant knowing which tree gave the best fruit and how it was used in that specific community. Looking at all of this, it becomes clear that fruit in that time did not exist in a separate decorative category. It sat right at the intersection of food, medicine, ritual, economy, and story. A cluster of berries on a branch might be part of a future drink, a healing remedy, a symbolic decoration, and a child's snack all at once. Every tree or bush with edible fruit became a small recurring character in the long unfolding story of a village or estate. If you imagine that same landscape today transformed by roads, buildings, and machines, it is easy to feel that something subtle went missing. Not just the flavours, but the relationships. When people no longer meet under a wild service tree to gather checkers, or walk along a hedge line to pick sloes and mulberries, they lose more than ingredients. They lose a reason to walk slowly, to pay attention to season and weather, to talk with neighbours while hands are busy filling baskets. Bringing these fruits back offers more than nostalgia or quirky curiosity. It offers fresh chances for those lost connections. A community that plants a rowan by its meeting place, a blackthorn hedge around a shared garden, or a mulberry tree in a schoolyard, is not only reviving a medieval fruit, it is creating a new excuse to gather, taste, and tell stories. Each harvest becomes a small event. Each jar of jam bottle, of cordial, or bowl of fresh fruit becomes a reminder that patience, observation, and shared work still have a place in modern life. In that sense, these old fruits have a lot to say to the present. They remind anyone who tastes them that richness is not only in sugar levels or glossy skin, but in the layers of meaning built over time. A medlar softening in straw, a handful of hackberries in a traveller's bag, a bowl of mulberries staining children's hands, or a spray of rowan berries over a doorway, all carry quiet lessons about resilience, creativity, and trust in slow processes. Imagine standing in your own kitchen, listening to rain on the window, and deciding that instead of scrolling through recipes for the same apple pie everyone already knows, you are going to cook like a medieval farmer with a secret orchard. Start with the simplest move. Take something familiar like a basic stew and give it the kind of sharp, bright twist people once got from barberries. If barberries are hard to find where you live, you can look for similar sour berries or dried fruits with a strong tart edge. The idea is not to recreate an exact recipe from a manuscript. The idea is to chase a feeling. Heavy meat, heavy roots, then one sharp, ruby-coloured ingredient that wakes up the whole bowl. That is the old barberry logic transplanted into a modern pot. Next, imagine playing with drinks the way medieval brewers and household experimenters did. A plain cider or neutral spirit sits in a glass jar. Instead of leaving it alone, you add a handful of very tart fruit or even something slightly bitter. Then tuck the jar away in a cool place and forget about it for a while. Sloes taught people that some flavours only come out when time and alcohol work together. You can follow that same rhythm just with different tools. Taste a little after a week, a month, 2 months. Watch how the flavour shifts, deepens, softens. There is a quiet joy in that process. No instant payoff, no same-day reward. You set something up, leave it in a dark corner, and trust that the jar is still doing its slow work while you wash dishes, answer messages, and move through ordinary life. Now picture a cutting board covered in small odd fruits. Maybe some are from a farmer's market that focuses on unusual produce. Maybe they are from a backyard or a community garden. A wrinkled little fruit that looks suspicious. A tiny apple that smells too sharp a berry that feels more like a nut than a piece of fruit. You slice them open, taste carefully, and keep notes. That simple act of tasting and writing turns you into the kind of observer who once noticed that service fruits keep well in straw, or that Saskatoon berries feel more filling than most fruit. You start to notice which flavours play well with honey, which ones can stand up to vinegar, which fruits taste flat when cooked, and which ones suddenly bloom when heated. This kind of attention is not only for professional chefs. Anyone with a pan and curiosity can do it. You can turn a kitchen into a small laboratory where forgotten instincts wake up, where you begin to trust your tongue more than the label on a package. Gardens are another place where these medieval fruits fit naturally into modern life. In a small yard, planting a medlar or a mulberry changes more than the view. It sets a long story in motion. The first years might bring only leaves and a handful of blossoms. Then one season fruit appears. At that moment you join a line of people stretching back hundreds of years who have stood under a fruit tree and wondered what to do with a crop that suddenly feels bigger than expected. Children in that house will grow up with seasonal markers that do not come from apps. They will remember that certain weeks smell like boiling jam, or that a particular month means ladders leaning against branches. They will learn almost without thinking about it, that some fruits taste best fresh, some only turn delicious after cooking, and some demand patient storage and time. In cities, even a balcony can host pieces of this story. A dwarf mulberry in a large pot, a container shrub that gives small sour berries, a rowan in a nearby park that drops berries for jam. For someone who lives surrounded by concrete and glass, a single plant that stains fingers purple in summer can feel like a tiny portal into a quieter, slower relationship with food. Then there is the digital side. All of these forgotten fruits sit inside a very specific niche for storytelling, especially online. Think about long-form videos that mix history, food, and lifestyle. A slow conversational episode about turning ugly brown medlars into luxurious dessert paste. A chapter about brewing homemade slow-infused spirits and talking through the thorny hedges that gave them to the world. A series on building a backyard hedge of blackthorn and rowan, complete with time-lapses of blossoms turning into berries and jars turning into glistening preserves. People are drawn to stories that make them feel like they have discovered a secret. These fruits are ready-made secrets. They have strange names, unusual habits, and in some cases slightly scandalous reputations. They sit at the intersection of comfort curiosity and mild weirdness. That combination fits long-form YouTube perfectly. Slow pacing, rich description, cozy visuals, and practical how-to moments. Imagine filming a sequence where you take viewers from a winter hedge loaded with sloes to a kitchen table full of glass bottles, then to a summer evening, months later when you pour the finished drink into small glasses. The fruit becomes a character in a mini-story with tension, transformation, and payoff. The same structure works for service fruits stored in straw for loquats appearing when nothing else grows, or for Saskatoon berries being turned into long-keeping survival food. Alongside video and cooking, there is room for art and design. Medieval fruits pair naturally with illustrated recipe cards, hand-drawn labels, and old-style diagrams of trees and hedges. A mulberry wine bottle with a label that looks like a page from a monastery herb book. A jar of rowan jelly with a stylized pentagram berry symbol on the lid. A slow gin bottle wrapped with a tiny sketch of a blackthorn hedge under a winter sky. These touches do more than soirees. They connect the physical object to its long backstory. Holding a jar that looks like it belongs on an old wooden shelf helps people feel like they are participating in a tradition, not just consuming a product. For anyone who likes to write or draw, these fruits offer endless prompts. A scene where two characters argue under a service tree that will outlive them. A painting of a child sitting in the branches of a mulberry tree, fingertips stained and pockets bulging. A quiet monologue delivered by someone stirring a pot of medlar paste while talking about patience and change. Each of these images carries a weight that comes from being anchored in real plants with real history. At the same time, none of this has to be heavy or overly serious. Medieval life was hard, but people still joked about fruit. They made fun of how medlars looked. They teased each other for grimacing when they bit a sloe too soon. They sang drinking songs about wines that made them talk to angels. Bringing these details into modern storytelling keeps things human. A video or story that mixes strange facts, cozy sensory details, and a few well-placed jokes feels honest and approachable. In the background of all these possibilities sits one simple, powerful idea. Food does not have to appear out of nowhere, perfect and anonymous. It can carry memory, weather, and work in every bite. Fruits like medlars, sorb apples, Saskatoon berries, and the rest of this old cast offer a path back to that understanding. A single tree in a yard or a single jar on a pantry shelf can act as a physical reminder. A reminder that flavour takes time, that resilience often hides in small tough packages, and that some of the most interesting things grow quietly at the edges of fields where hardly anyone looks. Imagine a small piece of land, not huge or dramatic, just a corner lot, a schoolyard edge, or a strip behind some houses. Nothing special at first glance. Now imagine using that little patch to rebuild something that almost disappeared, a living collection of lost medieval fruits. Start with the structure. Along the outer boundary plant blackthorn and hawthorn together, a mixed hedge full of thorns, blossoms, and sloe berries in autumn. That hedge acts like an instant history lesson. It shows how people once used plants instead of fences, letting the same line of growth keep animals in mark property and feed both birds and humans. A bit further in, choose a spot with good light for a rowan tree. When it flowers and fruits, it becomes a bright signal across the whole area. In early spring, bees work the white blossoms. Later, the clusters of red berries glow against the leaves. Underneath, you can plant herbs or ground cover and set a simple bench. That bench becomes one of those quiet places where people sit, sip a drink, and suddenly notice that the berries overhead are not just decoration. They are jam medicine and old superstition all in one. Closer to the centre plant, a mulberry. Give it room, the branches will want to spread and hang low. In summer, that tree becomes the place where kids gather hands and mouths stained dark, laughing while they pick. It also becomes the tree adults quietly appreciate when they stir mulberry into yogurt, bake it into a tart or ferment it into wine. The ground beneath will always look a little messy, but the mess is the price of abundance. On one side, place a medlar and a service tree. They will not be impressive right away. At first, they are just young trees that look a bit plain. Years pass. One autumn, people suddenly notice strange brown fruits hanging among the leaves. Someone who has heard the story explains bletting straw beds and patience. A few weeks later, the same fruits appear on a tasting table as rich, dark paste and soft spoonable pulp. Those trees turn time itself into an ingredient. If the climate allows Tuckalokwa into a warm, protected corner, this tree becomes the early season wonder. While most people still think of winter, this one starts to offer golden fruit. Anyone paying attention learns that not all ripening follows the same clock. Some fruits choose their own schedule and reward those who notice. Near a path, plant Saskatoon berries and maybe hackberries if they fit the environment. These shrubs and trees speak the language of resilience. They do not scream for attention. They survive heat, cold, and difficult soil. Their fruits dry easily and keep well. If you set a sign that says something like travel food, famine, backup, and secret pie ingredient, you can watch visitors suddenly see them through new eyes. In another corner, add cornelian cherry trees. Their fruits arrive in late summer and their wood remains strong long after leaves fall. Putting up a small panel that explains how one tree could supply medicine, dessert, and bow parts makes every visitor understand how packed with usefulness a single plant can be. Around the edges, weave in barberries where appropriate, safely away from cereal plots if any are nearby. Their tiny red fruits can be dried and sprinkled over rice or meat dishes, bringing the same flash of sour brightness that once cut through heavy medieval meals. Mixed with modern spices and grains, they link old kitchens to new ones. If this kind of planting happened in even a few communities, something interesting would start to shift. School classes could walk through and touch each tree while hearing stories that have nothing to do with textbooks. A teacher might hand out slices of dried Saskatoon berries during a lesson about survival in harsh climates. Another might have students taste a cranberry side by side with a cornelian cherry syrup to talk about medicine before pills. A history lesson could happen entirely outside under a rowan tree with kids drawing the shape of its berries and the star mark at their base. Local cooks and bakers might begin to request fruit from these trees for small runs of experimental products. A bakery could offer a limited weekend medlar tart explaining on a chalkboard how the fruit had to sit and soften for weeks before it was usable. A small bar could headline a seasonal, slow-infused spirit or a mulberry wine special and tell the story of the hedge or tree that produced it. For home cooks, having access to these fruits opens up a different kind of creativity. Instead of asking, "What can I do with apples again?" the question becomes, what happens if I pair Saskatoon berries with dark chocolate? Or what if I glaze roasted carrots with cornelian cherry syrup instead of honey? The old ingredients do not lock anyone into strict historical reenactment. They become new tools. Even people who are not particularly interested in cooking still benefit. A neighbourhood with a few of these trees feels different. In spring, the flowers bring bees and colour. In summer, berries attract birds. In autumn, the shapes of fruits and leaves change almost weekly. In winter, bare branches still hold meaning, because people know what will appear there when warmth returns. There are environmental benefits too. Many of these trees and shrubs support pollinators and wildlife in ways that a plain lawn never will. Blackthorn hedges provide habitat and shelter along with sloes. Mulberry and hackberry feed birds as well as humans. Rowan supports insects and offers berries that after frost become valuable winter food for certain species. Planting them is not just about preserving history, it is also about building richer, more robust small ecosystems in yards, parks and shared spaces. From a personal point of view, tending these fruits encourages a mindset shift. The world begins to feel less like a place where everything important arrives in trucks, and more like a place where value grows slowly around you. Watching a service tree mature over years underlines the idea that some investments do not pay out quickly, but are still worth making. Keeping a medlar tree teaches you to ignore initial appearances and trust in processes you cannot rush. The same attitude can bleed into other parts of life. If you are used to waiting months for a slow infusion to reach its best flavour, waiting an extra day or week for a project to turn out right feels less frustrating. If you have learned to judge a fruit by touch, smell and patience instead of sticker colour, you might start to rely more on your own senses and curiosity in general. All of this can be shared, filmed or written about in a very natural way. Instead of presenting fruit as trendy superfood, it can appear as a set of characters with quirks and histories. A video might follow the life of a single blackthorn hedge through the year, from blossoms to sloes to bottled spirits with jokes about puckered faces and scratched hands. Another might track a medlar harvest from tree to straw to kitchen, with honest reactions from people trying it for the first time. Those stories do something important. They reconnect people to the idea that flavour is not just a product but a relationship. It depends on weather, soil, time, mistakes and stubbornness. It involves old knowledge and new experiments. It grows in hedges that might look messy to someone used to clean lines, but which hum with life if you look closely. In the end, the forgotten fruits of medieval fields and gardens offer a kind of mirror. They show what life looks like when people rely on the land around them with intense focus, and when they're willing to work with plants that are not always easy or pretty at first glance. Choosing to bring those fruits into the present is really choosing to bring that attitude into the present. A bowl of Saskatoon berries on a table, a bottle of slow-infused drink on a shelf, a jar of rowan jelly in a fridge, a medlar tree in a corner of a yard, a mulberry shading a bench. Each one is a small daily reminder that food can have a story, that seasons can still matter, that the most interesting things are often hiding in plain sight on branches that most people stopped looking at a long time ago. So what happens if someone actually decides to give these fruits the second chance they deserve, not just in theory but in real life? Imagine recording a video that starts not in a studio kitchen but with a simple walk. A quiet lane, a hedge on one side, wind pushing through long grass. The camera follows your hand as you brush past thorns, leaves and berries that most people would call background. You stop, point and say something like, "Right here is where medieval people would have seen food medicine and drink ingredients. Most of us just see a scratchy hedge." You pick a slow show its dark blue skin and explain that it is basically inedible fresh, but becomes incredible after months in a bottle. You point to a cluster of rowan berries and talk about jam and protection charms. You find a straggly crab apple tree and break open one of the tiny sharp fruits talking about jelly and cider. In that moment you are doing exactly what medieval farmers did all the time. You are reading the landscape as a pantry. Then the scene cuts to a kitchen. The same fruits appear on a wooden board instead of on branches. You do not need a huge polished set. Simple table, good light, and the sound of a knife hitting a cutting board is enough. Viewers get to watch you wash, cut, taste, and react honestly. Some reactions will be funny. Biting a raw slow and trying not to pull a dramatic face. Chewing on a dried Saskatoon berry and being surprised by how filling it feels. Scooping medlar pulp out of a wrinkled skin and saying out loud that it looks like a mistake, then pausing when you realise how good it tastes. As you cook, you can weave in small bits of story, not a lecture, more like comments you would make to a friend while they stand nearby. While stirring a pot of mulberry jam, you mention that people once used this same juice as ink that still shows up in manuscripts. While bottling slow-infused spirits, you talk about blackthorn hedges, keeping animals in and strangers out. While thickening rowan jelly, you explain that in harsh winters it quietly fought off scurvy when nobody knew what vitamins were. If you are making long-form content, you have time to let scenes breathe. The camera can linger on boiling pots, slow bubbles rising and breaking, on glass jars filling with deep-coloured liquids, or baskets of strange little fruits softening in straw or on cloth. The pace can match the theme, slow, patient, deliberate. You can also involve other people. Invite a friend, a family member, or a neighbour to taste test without explanation. Hand them a spoonful of medlar paste and ask them what it reminds them of. Let them guess the ingredients in a drink flavoured with sorb apples and checkers. Record their confusion when they hear that the small brown, slightly ugly fruit they just enjoyed used to be so important that people fought in court about who owned the tree. These reactions make the history feel alive. Instead of staying on the page, it moves through faces and voices. Viewers see that these fruits are not just abstract notes in an old book. They are right there in a room, changing how people taste and how they think. Over time, you could build a whole series around this idea. One video focused on hedgerow fruits like Slow's rowan and crab apples. Another focused on long storage fruits like medlars and service fruits. Another on travel and survival fruits such as Saskatoon berries, hackberries and jujubes. One centred on luxury and status fruits such as mespilus and carefully grown loquats. Each episode could mix harvesting, cooking, tasting and story. For people who watch, the value is not only in recipes, it is in a different way of seeing the world. Once someone has seen a slow transform from an unpleasant raw fruit into a deep warming drink, they will never look at a thorny hedge the same way. Once they have watched medlars turn from hard pale orbs into soft dark sweetness, after weeks of waiting, they will understand letting in a way that words alone cannot give them. Behind the camera, something shifts too. Working with these fruits trains your attention. You start to notice what is growing in neglected corners in old parks along train tracks. You begin to recognise the shape of a mulberry leaf, the pattern of a service tree crown, the way Saskatoon berries cluster along a branch. Walks become small treasure hunts. You do not have to romanticise everything for this to work. You can be honest about the scratches from blackthorn, the mess under mulberry trees, the risk of planting barberry in the wrong spot, the long wait for certain trees to bear. Medieval life was not soft or simple, and these fruits sometimes demanded a lot from the people who relied on them. Sharing that reality makes the final results feel even more earned. There is also room in this story for experiments that medieval cooks never tried. They did not have yogurt or certain spices in everyday use. They did not bake the exact kinds of cakes or breads we have now. They did not have electric dehydrators or freezers. You do. That means you can combine Saskatoon berries with dark chocolate, slow-infused spirits with orange peel, and coffee mulberry jam with chili and lime, or cornelian cherry syrup with sparkling water and fresh mint. When you show those experiments, you are not breaking the spirit of the old fruits. You are doing exactly what people have always done, taking what grows around you and asking new questions. What if I try this combination? What if I change this step? What happens if I wait longer or use a different vessel? For some viewers, the most powerful part of this whole journey will not be the final dishes at all, but the long, quiet pieces. The months between picking sloes and tasting the finished drink. The weeks of checking medlars as they soften on straw. The seasons between planting a tree and seeing it bear properly. In a world that pushes speed and constant change, watching a process that refuses to be rushed feels strangely comforting. You can show that comfort in real time. Short updates, a quick clip of berries aging, trees leafing out, jars darkening. Over many episodes, those updates become a thread your audience can follow alongside you. At the end of a video or a series, you might not need a big dramatic conclusion. It might be enough to sit at a table surrounded by a few modest plates and cups and simply talk to the camera like you would to a friend over dinner. On the table there is slow-infused drink, Saskatoon bread, a small dish of medlar paste, some mulberries and a jar of rowan jelly. You taste each one and describe it. Then you say something simple. These are not fantasy foods. They're not inventions from a story. They used to be normal. People relied on them the way we rely on apples and bananas today. From there, you can invite viewers to do one small thing. Try to find one of these fruits near where they live, or plant one tree, or experiment with one unfamiliar berry they can actually source. Not as a big lifestyle change, just as a first step into a quieter, older way of relating to what grows around us. Because that is the real gift hidden in these odd medieval fruits. They do not just expand the menu, they shrink the distance between people and the land, between taste and time, between history and what ends up on a spoon. Picture someone watching all of this from a small apartment on the 10th floor of a city building, far away from any old hedgerow or stone farmhouse. They lean back, listen to the story of strange fruits with unpronounceable names, watch dark berries being dropped into glass bottles and quietly think, "That is cool, but I live next to a parking lot. What am I supposed to do with a medlar?" The answer does not have to be complicated. It can start with curiosity instead of land. Maybe the first step is simply learning to recognize a few of these fruits on sight. Not in person yet, but in photos, drawings, and simple diagrams. Knowing what a blackthorn branch looks like. Knowing how to tell a rowan berry from a random ornamental tree. Learning the shape of a mulberry leaf. Understanding that a bletted medlar looks wrinkled and dark, not glossy and perfect. That kind of visual vocabulary makes everyday walks feel different even in modern spaces. Once those images are in your mind, you start to notice echoes. A scruffy tree behind a supermarket, a row of unfamiliar shrubs along a canal, a half-forgotten corner of an old park. It is surprising how often fragments of older fruit cultures survive in places no one talks about. A lone mulberry planted decades ago for shade, a neglected rowan near a bus stop, a crabapple tree on a school boundary. You might not find every fruit from medieval fields, but even meeting one of them in person changes how real this whole world feels. If you have room for containers, you can go a bit further. A dwarf mulberry in a large pot on a balcony can still drip purple berries onto the tiles in summer. A small cornelian cherry in a courtyard can still hold clusters of red fruit later in the year. A large pot with a Saskatoon bush can still create a mini harvest once a year. You do not need an acre. You just need one or two plants that remind you that food does not only grow on shelves. From there, it becomes surprisingly natural to invite other people into this strange little project. A friend who likes cocktails might become very interested in slow-infused drinks if you explain that the tradition started with harsh little berries buried in hedges. Someone who bakes bread every weekend might be excited by the idea of crabapple jelly for glazes, or Saskatoon berries folded into dough. A neighbour who sketches or paints might want to draw rowan berries, blackthorn branches, or mulberry trees with children underneath. A small shared interest group can grow out of that. Not a grand organisation, more like a handful of people who trade fruit seedlings and experiments. One person might find a source for medlar saplings. Another might discover a market stall that carries cornelian cherries or barberries. Someone else might live near an old estate with mulberry trees and ask permission to forage. Together they slowly rebuild a very small, very local network of forgotten fruit knowledge. At that point, the content possibilities widen. It is no longer only about one person talking into a camera. It becomes a story about a tiny community teaching itself an old skill set. Viewers get to watch not just successes, but mistakes. A slow infusion that turns out too tannic. A jam that ends up way thicker than expected. A medlar harvest that was picked a bit too early and has to be rescued with extra patience and gentle heat. Those imperfections make everything feel more human. Medieval cooks didn't get everything right every time either. They burned pots, misjudged harvests, and occasionally ruined whole batches of carefully gathered fruit. Sharing similar stumbles today connects the present not just to the romantic parts of the past, but to the reality underneath. There is also room to talk about resilience without sounding like a manual. Many of these fruits are tough. Saskatoon and hackberry tolerate hard conditions that make softer plants give up. Blackthorn and rowan hold their own in storms. Mulberries forgive rough pruning and still show up with fruit. Medlars and service fruits store well when other produce gives up. Highlighting those traits speaks directly to modern worries about unstable weather and fragile supply chains. Instead of vague anxiety, viewers see concrete examples of living systems that can handle stress. A hedge that both blocks wind and feeds people. A tree that produces fruit for decades with modest care. A berry that retains its nutrients after drying. None of these things solve global problems by themselves, but together they sketch a picture of small-scale stability. For people who like exploring niche subjects, this whole territory is a goldmine. It is not overdone, it is not saturated with identical videos, and it has a built-in mix of drama and calm. On one side there are thorny branches, sharp flavours and strange traditions like deliberately letting fruit soften until it looks spoiled. On the other, there are quiet scenes of jam jars cooling on a cloth frost slowly touching hedgerows and mugs of dark cider steaming in cold air. Long-form content thrives on that contrast. You can have a section where the pace picks up as you climb through brambles to get to the best slows, followed by a gentle section where nothing happens except fruits simmering while you talk over it in a relaxed voice. You can switch between close-ups of hands working with fruit and wide shots of landscapes where those plants came from. There is also a narrative thread that never really runs out. Trees take years to grow. Hedgerows take seasons to fill in. Slow infusions take months. A series about medieval fruits can stay alive not by constantly adding more and more obscure species, but by returning to the same plants over time. Each revisit shows a new stage. Blossoms, green, fruit, ripe fruit, bare branches. Young trees, older trees, first harvests, heavy harvests. Each year adds another layer without repeating the same story. For viewers who stick around, that slow continuity feels rewarding. They remember when a blackthorn sapling was barely waist high. They watch it become a hedge that needs pruning. They remember the first tiny jar of medlar paste and see later clips with whole trays of fruit. They remember when you tried jujubes for the first time and later see you casually drop them into recipes as if they'd always been there. All this time, the main lesson running quietly underneath is simple. Food culture is not fixed. It can lose things, and it can bring them back. A fruit that vanished from everyday life for centuries can become familiar again in one household, then a street, then a town. Not because a corporation decided to market it, but because people decided it was worth their effort. In the bigger picture, that kind of decision builds a certain kind of hope. if there are still old resilient flavours hiding in hedges and forgotten trees. Then there are still options. There are still ways to adapt to diversify what we eat, to reattach meals to seasons and places. These medieval fruits become small tangible symbols of that possibility. So when someone finishes watching a long video about these strange characters from the past, the ideal outcome is not just that they remember a few new names. It is that they feel a nudge to look twice at the shrubs on their daily walk, a nudge to buy one odd-looking fruit in a market and see what happens in a pan, a nudge to plant one tree that might only really show its worth to the next person who lives in that house. If even a handful of people act on that feeling, the story of these lost fruits quietly shifts. They stop being only museum pieces in books and start being something more interesting. Background characters in modern lives, quiet partners in new recipes, landmarks in neighbourhoods, slow teachers of patience in backyard experiments. That is how a medieval fruit becomes modern again. Not as a fad, not as a logo, but as a living thing growing roots in real soil, forming new memories for people who might never have guessed that names like medlar, sorb, apple, or hackberry would end up feeling familiar. Imagine taking all these fruits and treating them like a cast of characters in a long-running story rather than just ingredients on a list. Each one has a personality, a role, and a set of strengths. Framing them this way makes it easier to keep them alive in your mind and makes it much easier to build content conversations and experiences around them. Think about the medlar as the patient elder. It looks rough and uninviting at first, then turns out to be wise and generous once given time. Sorb apples are the bold troublemakers, sharp and tannic, the ones who sneak into barrels and change quiet drinks into something deeper. Service fruits are the quiet backbone characters, never flashy but always there when storage and stability really matter. Cornelian cherries feel like the healer of the group, arriving with bright red energy and a clear role in keeping bodies strong. Barberries are sharp wits, the one that cut through heaviness and keep everything from becoming dull. Loquats are the early optimists, showing up when nothing else is ready, and reminding everyone that sweetness can return even when the year still feels cold. Jujubes are the travellers. They adapt, shift from crisp to chewy, move along routes across continents and seasons. Mulberries are the generous extroverts, spilling fruit everywhere, feeding children, birds, and fermentation jars with equal enthusiasm. Saskatoon berries are the tough, quiet workers, not flashy, but absolutely dependable under pressure. Rowan berries feel like guardians. They hang like little symbols of protection, turning bitterness into useful preserves and carrying folk beliefs on each cluster. Sloes are the misunderstood ones. Terrible, raw, incredible. When transformed, they are the perfect example of how first impressions can mislead. Checker fruits are the tavern regulars, always hanging around barrels, extending the life of ale and adding a subtle flavour that keeps people coming back. Hackberries are survivors. They grow where others give up and turn into compact energy bars long before that phrase existed. Mespilus is the mysterious, noble, rare and carefully tended offering refined sweetness in small, precious servings. Crab apples are the hard-working ancestors who tolerate rough conditions and still manage to turn out essential jellies and strong ciders. Taking that cast, you can design whole sequences of content that feel more like seasons in a series than separate, disconnected uploads. One cluster of episodes could revolve around patience and transformation, featuring medlars, sloes, and mesplis. Another sequence could explore survival and stamina, focusing on Saskatoon berries, hackberries, and jujubes. A third could look at protection and boundaries with rowan blackthorn and service trees at the centre. That structure fits very naturally with long-form storytelling. Each episode can introduce one or two fruits, show them in context, demonstrate a recipe or use, and then leave a small thread dangling that leads into the next one. The result is not just a random assortment of topics, but a guided tour through a world that steadily becomes more familiar. Along the way, you can connect these fruits to modern concerns without forcing the comparison. Medlars and service trees offer a way to talk about slow reward in a culture that constantly pushes instant results. Saskatoon berries and hackberries offer a way to talk about resilience and nutritional density in a time when people worry about supply chains and food security. Blackthorn and rowan offer a way to talk about living fences and layered functions in landscapes. The niche potential is strong because this mix is unusual. It sits at the crossing of food history, practical cooking gardening, and quiet lifestyle content. It has room for cozy scenes and sharp humour. There are serious elements like medicine and survival, but there is also space for jokes about sour faces, stained hands, and strange fruit names. Visual style can reinforce this blend. Warm natural lighting, lots of close-ups of hands handling fruit wooden surfaces, clay pots, glass jars, and outdoor shots of hedges and trees. Simple sounds like cutting, boiling, pouring, wind, and birds will support the mood far more effectively than heavy effects. Viewers end up feeling like they're sitting at a real table or walking through real fields, not watching a stage performance. Over time, you can invite your audience to participate in small ways. Ask them to share if they have ever seen a tree or shrub that matches one of the descriptions. Encourage them to try one simple experiment like making a tart jelly from tart berries they can actually buy, or infusing a small bottle of spirit with a fruit they want to explore. Some people may send photos of mulberry-stained hands or jars of experimental jam. Those contributions help transform the topic from concept into community practice. You can also build simple frameworks that people can replicate. For example, a 4-part fruit year structure where each season focuses on 1 or 2 roles. Early part of the year might be about hope and first harvests with loquats and early cherries. Mid part might concentrate on abundance with mulberries and cornelian cherries. Late part can centre on preservation with medlars, service fruits, and crab apples. The coldest part of the year can focus on drinks, dried fruits, and emergency stores with sloes, Saskatoon berries, hackberries, and rowan. Within that cycle, you can return to the idea that these fruits teach specific skills. Patience from medlars and service trees, cautious experimentation from sloes and barberries, respect for thorn and boundary from blackthorn hedges, awareness of hidden strength from the small but powerful Saskatoon berry. Each skill is as relevant now as it was centuries ago, just applied to different tasks. For personal life outside of cameras and content keeping, even 1 or 2 of these plants nearby acts as a grounding practice. Watching a mulberry leaf out each year, seeing rowan blossoms turn into berries, noticing how a medlar responds to weather all pulls your attention away from purely digital rhythms and into the slower, more steady rhythm of living things. On stressful days, there is something calming about stirring a pot of fruit that has been quietly ripening for weeks, or shaking a bottle that holds berries you picked months earlier. The knowledge that you started something in one season and are enjoying it in another makes time feel less compressed and more layered. In that sense, the medieval fruit basket is not just a curiosity from the past. It is a practical toolkit for building a different relationship with time, place, and food in the present. Each fruit is a reminder that value can hide in odd shapes, that flavour can come from patience, that toughness and richness often go together, and that what looks like a forgotten hedge or a cruffy tree might actually be a door back into a way of living that feels steadier and more connected than the one many people are used to now.